So my topic really is, so what really does happen to the spiritual director in the ministry of doing spiritual direction, particularly with the exercises? And I want to begin with this story. So prior to my coming here, I did some formation work at a parish in our diocese here, and Diocese of Rochester, and I had this experience. I had a cohort of people who were making the exercises, and a gentleman who I was directing was in the first week. And I knew very little about this man, and we did the usual intake. I know he was a corporate lawyer for one of the big firms here in Rochester, dad of 3 kids, pretty high achieving, very generous in his time and presence in the parish. And he wanted to deepen his relationship with God. And so we were doing the exercises. He is in the first week. And one day I get a phone call from him, and he said, Damian, I think this is over. I can't do this. Nothing's happening in my prayer. And I said, well, look, before you toss the baby out with the bath of water, why don't you come in? Let's have a conversation so I can get a sense of where you're at. And here was this is where he got stuck. He was praying the triple colloquy. And he was fine in going to Jesus and going to Mary. But when it came to coming to God, he was paralyzed. He was paralyzed. And he said, I tried it once, I tried it again, and I tried it a 3rd time. And he goes, that just tells me I'm not supposed to be doing this. I said, okay, so let's just humor me one more time. I'm going to ask you to go back. And this time, just ask God to meet you where you're at. That's all. Okay, not thinking of what could possibly happen in this next encounter. The next week, the gentleman is at my door and he is sobbing profusely. He is sobbing. He is, and this is a big guy. He's about 6'8", 6'7". He's about 250, and he is just, he couldn't catch his breath to start telling me what happened. And this is what happened in his prayer. He said in his prayer, he was 7 years old. And as the prayer progressed, he lifted his hand to Mary, and Mary took his hand, and then they went to Jesus, and Jesus took his hand. And all this time, his head was down. He said, then out of nowhere, God came to me and simply lifted my head up, and I looked in the eyes of God. And I haven't been able to stop sobbing since. He went on to tell me that he had a meeting during that week with his psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist, who said to him, Dave, whatever happened in that prayer, and I don't know what you Catholics do, she said, but that could never, ever have happened in this office, because that is something that can only happen in your soul. Friends, I was that has stayed with me all these years. And in preparing for our conversation this afternoon, that story keeps coming to me, because I thought I knew what it meant to have God meet us where we're at. I never saw it until I experienced it in listening to this man's story. Then, as he's unpacking this story with me, he's talking about how he could not go to God because he had had a history of terrible abuse at the hands of his father, both physical and psychological. Could never, ever match up to what his father expected of him. And as I have been reflecting all these years on that one privileged place of being with this human being, how gracious of God to meet him where he was stuck. And just in that simple gesture of lifting that little boy's chin up, right, to look in the eyes of God, how healing in that instant that was. And how God does that number 3, that deep psychological healing that can happen in the first week of the exercises. That was confirmed by a Jewish psychiatrist. And so I present that story to us as I begin to reflect with you on what happens to somebody when they listen. I mean, this is one of the first times I've told that story where I myself don't break down and cry, because that grace is still so poignant all these years later. And to know how God simply wants to meet us where we're at in the, in the suffering of our lives, and how that can just open out to the future. So what happened to me? My curiosity, my awareness of how God works in the exercises. What happened to me was this a deeper appreciation for the privilege of the charism to do spiritual direction and to be a spiritual director. And what privileged a place for me as a director to be so proximate to the intimate workings of God in another person's soul. And so what it does, it really takes what I've been called to do and who I have been called to be as a spiritual director, because I think the two have to be hand in hand, to a whole new level of gratitude. At the same time, it's a very hidden ministry, as you all know, because we certainly can't share the intricacies of what we hear in direction, right? Unless we're in supervision. And so I share that story with you, and then I want to talk a little bit about this this way, or this manner of doing spiritual direction in the Ignatian tradition. So as Bob mentioned earlier, since about 2004, I've been on faculty in the Christian Spirituality program at Creighton University, and it's a 3-year summer program. Now, many of our courses are online, but I was pretty much, for most of my time there, practicum, post-practicum director. And what I have come to appreciate even more in being a part of this program, and in doing the work that I'm doing now with Tom Slon in Buffalo in the Spiritual Directors Institute, is to help people become formed in what is known as the contemplative evocative method of how we do spiritual direction. Now, it's not new to us. It's been around since it's after the council with Recensement, when the council called all religious congregations to go back to their roots. The Jesuits, of course, went back to the exercises and said, hey, look, we're sitting on something that is very, very precious to us. How can we get this out? And the Center for Development in Boston kind of developed or retrieved or refashioned what is the Ignatian, what is the Jesuit way of doing spiritual direction. And so what's very important to me in this contemplative evocative method is it begins in silence. Silence is the most critical piece of a director's way of being, right? We are curious, like I am curious about what happened with this man to bring about this profound emotional experience, right? And as a director, and as we have taught at Creighton, which, by the way, that method you might know. Okay, so Maureen Conroy, a Sister of Mercy, she taught for many years in the Creighton program. You might know some of the books she published were Looking into the Well, Discovering Heart, Experiencing God's Tremendous Love. She studied in Boston. She studied at the Center for Development, and she popularized this method in her books, right? But it really, I think, it's a very special way of being in direction where we're focused on a person's experience, but we create this environment of silence that will allow some curious, okay, evocative, like to help people to explore their experience. We ask questions, okay? We ask questions to help us understand, but even more importantly, for them to understand how God is working in them, right? So my point of all this, and here's my big giveaway to something you already know. As Ignatian directors, we understand that spiritual direction is a gift of God that happens to two people in the ministry of spiritual direction. God is forming two people. When we are with our directees, we We are in that support place to help people explore their religious experience, their mystical experience, they don't even have words for it, right? And then in our own silence and in our own supervision, right, to be able to be before God and ask the question, what's the grace for me? What are you giving to me? What are you inviting me to? What part of my humanity are you revealing to me in this episode that happened with this one person? And so I think that's one of the big things that I hope to share today with you is that we are constantly being formed. And I also often say to my students at Creighton, if you really want to be an Ignatian spiritual director, buckle up because your formation is lifelong, right? So we may have made the 19th annotation, we may have made the 30-day retreat. Some of us may have made both. Some of us may have made that multiple times. But when we're in the ministry of directing the exercises, we make the exercises again. Now, I don't mean that we're praying the same material, but the graces, right? God is continuing to form us in those graces. And I think one of the last things I would like to share with you, if you have not gotten Joe Tetlow's book, it was just published last summer. I think it's a must read for anybody who does Ignatian spiritual direction. So it's called Handing on the Fire, Making Spiritual Direction Ignatian, Joe Tetlow. Joe, of course, is in his 90s. And I think that one of the biggest gifts that he is leaving us, here's his legacy, is after a lifetime of doing spiritual direction with the exercises, he's one of the very first people who's beginning to think deeply about what distinguishes us, what happens to us when we're doing this. And I wanted to, one of the highlights from page 29 that I've just pulled out for our purposes today, Joe says, a good director's focus is always on the directee's relationship with God. He wants to know, she wants to know what's happening in their relationship with God, not what's happening in a person's psychological life. So you see what he's doing. He's the next generation after Barry and Connolly, who are coming out of a more therapeutic, clinical, right, approach, because that's where we were. We're talking about resistances, we're talking about transferences, we're talking about, but those are psychological things, right? What we want to do is go deeper into how that helps us to understand the dynamics of consolation, desolation, and what's happening to us in the midst of all of this. But so he goes a little bit further. Joe says, we're interested in the prayer, but we're also interested in how the prayer affects a person's life. Spiritual direction is praying. When we are doing spiritual direction, we are in an active, contemplative stance of praying. Think about that. And we're constantly asking ourselves, as we're attentive to the movements within, what is God inviting me to? What am I being made aware of? Where are my desires in this? Where do I not want to go? Which, as you know, is probably where we need to go. So there's a constant call to what? For the Ignatian director, conversion. And conversion is always from to. What is God helping to convert me from in terms of where I am to who I can be? And the end product, my friends, as you know, is very clear. Transformation into the likeness of the Son of God, so that we end up exactly where Paul was when he said, it is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. What Teresa of Avila, what John of the Cross talks about in that mystical marriage, that when we are sitting across from another person and we know it in the deep, deep, deep marrow of our spiritual bones, things that come to us, it's not me. That's Christ moving. And there's this privileged place of being, as one of my very cheeky juniors, when I first came to McQuaid, I taught a course and we were talking about Jesus and what was Jesus's biggest gift to us. And of course, But this one cheeky little gentleman says, well, Jesus was a medium. I'm like, oh, gee. Next thing you're going to tell me he read crystals. I have no idea what this child was talking about, but it was a brilliant insight because he said, listen, Jesus wasn't about himself. He said what he did was he channeled God to people. And I thought, wow, in that 16-year-old understanding, theologians, mystics have tried to help us understand all these years that in the process of doing spiritual direction, ours is to get out of the way and allow us to channel God to whomever, a place of privilege, a place of honor, and a place that will keep us continuously deepening in our own humility. So that's how we become deeper friends, more intimate friends of Jesus, which is what the society is all about and what they invite us to share in Ignatian spirituality. So given that, I thought I would then open this up now to our own conversation of, since you have been directing the exercises, how have you grown in your own journey to God? It's not about technique. It's not about knowing the theology of each one of the weeks or their dynamics, but from this talk, what has happened to you in the process of directing?